All right. Well, I appreciate you all eating rapidly in surgical fashion to be back here so that we're not too far behind. We've got a couple outstanding panels still to go during the day today. So it is now my pleasure to introduce the moderator for this next panel on clinical ethics and the clinician, Dr. Alexia Torkey, who is professor of medicine and associate division chief of general internal medicine and geriatrics at Indiana University School of Medicine. She is the director of the Evans Center for Religious and Spiritual Values in Healthcare and a research scientist with the Indiana University Center for Aging Research at the Regenstrief Institute. Lexi's current research focuses on surrogate decision-making for older adults with dementia and other forms of cognitive impairment, including a randomized trial of spiritual care in the ICU setting and advanced care planning for older adults in the community. She's received funding from the NIH, the Greenwall Foundation, and other funding sources. So it's really a pleasure for me to welcome Dr. Torkey, who will moderate this session. Thank you, Lex.
Thank you, Peter. Great to be here with all of you today. And for those of you on Zoom, we have had a little bit of a switch in order just because of travel arrangements and other considerations. And so I'm going to first introduce Dr. Timothy Seelaff. Dr. Seelaff is currently an executive fellow working as a health economics and care model innovation researcher and teacher at the Opus College of Business at the University of St. Thomas in the Twin Cities. Welcome.
Thank you so much. My gosh, what an absolute honor and pleasure it is to be here. Thanks to Dr. Siegler and Dr. Angelos, and the people at the University of Chicago have been beyond gracious. So I'm just so floored by this opportunity. So thank you. All right, I have many conflicts. None of them are financial, and there are none that I wish to disclose. And as I start this talk, I want to start with this. So this is one of my patients. He gave me enthusiastic permission to use this picture. He was the first person I did a laparoscopic right lobe liver resection on many years ago, and he was a bodybuilder. That's why I think he was enthusiastic. And I just want to turn back to, learning from our patients and listening to our patients and partnering with our patients. And although I went into liver surgery maybe because it's only on one side and you can always find it. He thought that I needed a little bit of additional help. Turns out he went home the same day that I did his operation against my preference, but did just fine. And I learned a lot from that as well. So that's to remember him. I also turned to this quote, especially in teaching in the MBA program, that I think that it would be very helpful for folks that are in business, folks that are looking at enormous amounts of data, to turn back to this Elie Wiesel quote. We must not see any person as an abstraction. And as I talk about the business of medicine, and medicine is a business, always know that that patient and patients like him and this quote are at the basis of how I conduct myself as both a clinician and as a healthcare administrator. My objectives are to look for a link between the fantastic talks that we've had about policy and the fantastic talks that we've had about everything that happens so vitally at the bedside, and look at the role of the health system. And I don't mean the health system as the entirety of the health system. I mean the University of Chicago medicine, the hospital that you work in, the system that you work in, maybe Advocate Aurora, whatever it happens to be. So look at the system. And my life as a chief medical officer of a large integrated health system was in between the bedside and the health system itself. And it was my responsibility to serve as a translator for the clinicians who were doing the work, the providers, the nurses, the respiratory therapists, everybody, and the executive leadership team, which I was a part of in the health system as well. So that role of being in the middle sometimes is challenging, but it's also very rewarding. This is a quote that I think my cohort folks would recognize, that I'm constantly harping about the system, kind of like the Monty Python movie, what have the Romans ever done for us? What has the health system ever done for us? And I think we'll sort of get to look at that a little bit. It's not perfectly clear who said this. It might have been Edwards Deming in the 50s or 60s. It might have been Don Berwick, might have been Paul Batalden, some people at IHI. But when we think about a problem that we're facing it because the whole system was designed to make that happen. Now you don't want to have that problem happen. They didn't design it intentionally to have that problem happen, but the system is what leads to the problems that we deal with on a daily basis. So we had a fantastic talk about burnout, so I'm not going to go over that again, except to say that in Minnesota, the Minnesota Hospital Association over 3 years did a serial provider survey of burnout using the mini Z score and a variety of other things. And it was actually at the time the largest sequential survey of providers for burnout. And by providers, I mean APPs and physicians as well. And what we did, I was the chair of the CMO committee. What we did is provided each system an individualized report. And the report had, different domains from the mini Z and some, numbers, but really the richest information was in the narratives. And it was remarkable the number of people who took the time to, sort of spill their guts over what was happening in their daily work life. Now, this is all pre-COVID. And so what we did at the MHA is provided this information, and then different health systems took that information and they created, with physician leadership, they created ways of addressing burnout, and actually made a difference across the state in different areas, whether it's the EMR, whether it's compensation, et cetera. And this is not meant to be read except to know that it's a complex set of issues. But from a management standpoint, the HR folks looked at the burnout survey as something that was really unfamiliar. And they have 20, 30 years of doing employee engagement surveys, and looked at the burnout data as, well, what are we going to do with that? We know how to deal with employee engagement, and employee engagement's been better studied, and maybe that's more relevant than burnout. And the worst situation to be in is to be engaged and to be burned out. Engage means somebody was doing their epic work up in the audience a little bit earlier. You're doing that, and it's taking something away from you. It's really torching you from a burnout standpoint. So, it's just important to see the way that we might think about things as clinicians and the way managers might think about things. So another example is the notion of hospital at home. So hospital at home is just as it sounds. And the organization I worked at had a phenomenal post-acute care team that spun up a hospital at home program. And it was very patient-centered. It actually had basically instantaneous language congruency. So it was very good for disparate populations. There was not a great financial lever. But if you look at government payers, you lose less money on a Medicaid patient who stays at home and gets great care than one who comes into the hospital and gets great care. It addressed equity issues, and certainly it had stood a test of change, and there was actually a good literature in this regard. When management looked at it, the notion was, well, we don't really have the resources to do this. There's not really strategic alignment, and there were internal externalities. In other words, if you were to take somebody from the emergency department and send them back home with hospital at home support, that means they're not going into the hospital, which means you're not generating a bill that is dependent upon. So there'd be a risk of a margin impact. Now, the crucible of COVID changed all that. So the notion of keeping people out of the hospital who didn't need to be in the hospital, or helping people go home a day or 2 or 3 earlier, became like a brilliant idea. And this actually blew up in a very positive way, and tens of thousands of patients have been triaged into different versions of hospital at home in a way that actually turned it into its own business. So how did management think about this, and what were the constraints of their thinking? And what did the physicians do that maybe didn't solve the problems as they needed to be solved? And then the third example are equity gaps. Minnesota likes to say that it's #1 in healthcare and it's #1 in education. It's also #1 in healthcare gaps with equity populations, and #1 in education gaps with equity populations. So this is a graph from a health system, and the majority population is in red, the minority population in blue. And you can see that as the health system does an intervention, this is colorectal cancer screening, does an intervention, all boats rise, but the gap persists, and the gap is not acceptable. And we've had, spectacular talks about that here as well, but the gap just always persists. This is from Minnesota Community Measurement, Optimal Vascular Care. If you go to their website, you'll just see all the gaps that persist, whatever the measurement is. There are gaps between the majority population and the equity populations. So When you look at this, you see the equity populations are suffering from a gap. But when you look deeper, and our enterprise data warehouse in that health system was able to look at race, ethnicity, and language in very fine detail. So we could know Somali folks, we could know Hmong folks, we could know African-American folks. They're not homogeneous, and the solutions to colon cancer screening, for instance, for the Somali population proved to be better accepted but different than might be for the Hmong population. So there are community-specific solutions that need to be addressed. And in addressing community-specific solutions, there's a discretionary effort that needs to go into that. And that discretionary effort means multiple workflows for relatively small numbers of patients in Minnesota, for instance. So the business case is elusive. So what might the stakeholders have been thinking? The care teams are looking at this and they're saying, our colleagues, in burnout are disadvantaged, our patients are being disadvantaged. This thinking that we're dealing with is really narrow, and there's this inertia of the status quo that really is torching us. And executive management might be looking at, it's not on our strategic roadmap. I put consultants in parentheses because that's kind of my least favorite profession as a healthcare person. The outcomes are soft, they're too vague. There's not an economic engine. And in Minnesota anyway, there's this thing we call the slow no, which means, yeah, maybe. And then you just go away for 6 months and then you come back in 9 months. If that's familiar to some of you. Yeah, so watch out about the slow no. So this is probably the most important slide I would offer for y'all to interact with management. To when you see a problem, how do you work upwards with great solutions that you might come up with clinically? And as clinicians, what we usually talk about are light green dollars. So light green dollars are how we're doing better, how we're avoiding complications, how we're improving safety, how just all the improvement sort of ethic that we typically have. Dark green dollars are dollars that can go into a budget. So if you are advocating for a clinical improvement process, try to figure out how to calculate the dark green dollars. Dark green dollars go into a budget, and that gets a manager's attention. Everything else is sort of, Charlie Brown's teacher. So really, really think about how you can make that dark green dollar argument. And from what we heard just at the last talk, it is absolutely the case that better care is less expensive, more efficient. All of that triple bottom line thing is so compelling. It takes some added effort. It takes some added partnership with folks in management to create that dark green dollar number from clinical improvement, but it can be done. It's not rocket science. It's not physical chemistry. Semi-jokingly, the providers look at the executive leadership team in this way, and the executive leadership team might look at the providers in this way. So anybody who's over 50 will recognize the reference. If you're under 50, you probably don't. So let's talk about the tensions. The tensions can be laid out in this way. Ron Heifetz from Harvard talks about technical change and adaptive change. Technical change means, flip a switch and you think that everything's going to be okay. Adaptive change means really changing the hearts and minds of the folks that are doing the work. And that's the really hard stuff to do. And that's something that we as clinicians should be able to organize. And there's this notion of profit versus reinvestment, prevention versus rescue. We are great at rescue, right? I mean, we are fantastic at rescue. We're not so good at prevention. And there's this quote from Irene Krauss, Sister Irene Krauss, no margin, no mission. When somebody says that to you, put your hand on your wallet, because they're probably advocating for an outcome that may not be congruent with what you're trying to accomplish. So there's the sort of the dichotomies of these tensions, and I would just suggest always be sort of cautious about dichotomies, because oftentimes they're false and they're meant to sort of trick you, negotiate you into making an argument that really doesn't create new value. Oftentimes new value is in the space between those two. And as we feel so strongly about the doctor-patient relationship, it is part and in tension with the business of medicine. And we talk about that all the time. But tension can be used to our benefit. And how do we find that middle ground? Michael Porter from the Harvard Business School talks about value, and we talk about value all the time, value-based care, all that stuff. Value is generally looked at as outcomes, everything good that we do, quality, safety, service, curing cancer, whatever it happens to be, divided by the cost of delivering that outcome. And we think, well, yeah, that's a unifying term. We all know what value means. Except we all have our own points of view, and different parts of society, different constituents in the healthcare continuum have a different view of what value is, what the outcomes are, and the costs are. Whose costs? Once I've paid all my premiums, my deductibles for the year, I don't care how much something costs. I want that MRI tomorrow. So there are these different types of analyses. So what are the ethical frameworks that we can use? Is ethics a way that we can bring these two things together? Well, there's really not a ton written about organizational ethics in the literature right now. So I think it's it's not nothing, but there's not a ton written about organizational ethics. So I think there's an opportunity to connect clinical medical ethics with organizational ethics. And this is one framework that is proposed from a Harvard Business Review paper, that organizational ethics are a function of a belief problem and a design problem when it doesn't come out the way it should. And so let me just pull one of those notions out. Let me pull the incentives notion out. And, we all have incentives. We have intrinsic incentives and we have extrinsic incentives. The managers have incentives as well. They have intrinsic incentives in feeling good about, being a part of an organization that is helping the community, that's improving the health status of the folks that they treat, and supporting the caregivers. So there are intrinsic and extrinsic motivations, if some of them are by proxy. Then there are board-driven goals that the organization has, and then there are personal financial goals that you might not even know about. CEOs are bonused on bond ratings for their organization. They're bonused on the margin percent, et cetera. So really trying to understand the incentive structure for the people for whom you're working and with whom you're working, I think is really important. And so I would summarize that as figuring out, as you're bringing your dark green dollar improvement issue, figuring out who is deciding and what are their incentives. It's not trivial to do that, but that's kind of the crux of working through the business of medicine. This is attributable to Edwards Deming. A bad system will beat a good person every time. And it is the system in which we work that is the issue. This guy is Simon Sinek. He's a jazzy sort of business guy. He'll go give talks to folks who make widgets. And he talks about this notion of, we know what to do and how to do it, but really, why are we doing it? Now, when you're making widgets, the why might be, elusive as well. And so I think it's important for those folks to engage with this notion. But we in healthcare, are we not tripping over the why every day? And are we not, in our family, is the why not there? Our neighbors, not the why that's there. So in healthcare, I think we're really lucky that we don't have to worry about why. In healthcare, our opportunity is to think about what if. So what if we can bring together what we're doing for our patients and our communities and partner with the managers, partner with administration, understand what's driving administration, and use that in partnership to create new value that we can all agree upon and that can help our health systems. So with that, I will stop, and generous thank you to Prometheus for founding my surgical career. And I'll take any questions. Thank you.
Oh, hi. As a hospital epidemiologist, I often have my feet in both sides of this issue. I attend all of the executive huddles and work closely with many of the top executives in the hospital, but also see patients and do ethics like you all and see both sides of this problem. And I think that one of the pieces that I've found really important to understand is that those dark green dollars, as you're talking about, are what make things work that cost light green dollars, and that there have to be both involved. But one thing that as a clinician that I find really difficult, and as someone who's really about preventing things which don't have any dark green dollars attached to them, what's your advice about how to get things moved forward when you don't have any? There's no dark green dollars. There's a lot of light green dollars, a lot of opportunity, a lot of access, a lot of value, but no dark green dollars.
That's a great question and a common problem. I would suggest that if you had the right partners, you probably could find a dark green dollar argument, but it's not trivial. So in the absence of being able to do that, I would suggest you really have to hammer the numerator of the value equation. And you have to link the numerator with the mission of your organization. I look at the work the University of Chicago did with standing up the Level 1 Trauma Center. Peter and I were talking on Thursday. I didn't even apply to the University of Chicago for my surgical residency because they didn't have a trauma center. What Dr. Rogers showed, how the health status has been improved, is just phenomenal. So I think that if you hammer the numerator, you can start to drive organizational change and drive the organization to align in a way that helps create the dark green dollar, whether it's through philanthropy, whether it's through contracts with the state, whatever it happens to be. You know, y'all are the smartest people, and nobody cares about patients and the outcomes in our communities than you do and the people on the video. And man, I think that if we're going to change the system, and it's hard to change it from within, you're the people to do it. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Seelaff. As I'm inviting Dr. Brudney up to the podium, I just want to update everybody about the order is that Dr. Brudney will go next, and then we'll have a presentation by Laura Roberts, and then we'll be kind of back on order with Daniel Golden, Daniel Kim, and Lori Zoloth. So now to introduce Dr. Daniel Brudney. Great to see him again. He is the Florin Harrison Pugh Professor in the Department of Philosophy and the college at the University of Chicago. He's also associate faculty in the MacLean Center for Clinical Medical Ethics and associate faculty in the Divinity School. So please welcome Dr. Brudney.
Can you hear me? So it's great to be here, and I've just realized that I'm part of the Daniel panel, and I'm delighted to be part of the Daniel panel. I want to first, of course, thank Peter and Mark for the invitation to be here today. And Mark, I will never cease thanking you for getting me involved with the MacLean Center, which has genuinely changed my life for the better. So I'm very, very grateful. I'm a philosophy professor, so I can only wish that I had a couple of conflicts of interest to disclose. What I'm going to be a change of pace today. There have been so many really wonderful, practically oriented talks that's a little embarrassing to come up with one that doesn't have any kind of clear output, but it will have a small one. Usually when I give a talk at this conference, I'm doing what philosophy professors do. I'll take this or that moral concept, I'll probe about it, and try to show you how puzzling and complex it is. Today I'm going to do something a little bit different. I'm going to be programmatic. I'm trying to begin a conversation about what's involved in talking philosophy at the bedside by clinicians. Now, philosophical issues are rife at the bedside. Some of these issues are about political philosophy, including the concerns we've heard about endemic and systemic racism and sexism. These are things that Dr. Peake and Dr. Ross and many others have already discussed. And these clearly have to be acknowledged and clearly must be dealt with. There's no question there. But I want to talk about philosophical issues where there might be a question about the need at the bedside to think about these things. So I'm going to just talk about four, but there are lots of others. The four I'll mention are the theory of personal identity, as it's relevant to the authority of advance directives. The standard for decisional capacity, which assumes a very disputed interpretation of the nature of practical reason. The overly capacious concept of coercion that's often used at the bedside and that can complicate ways of dealing with families and patients. And then the permissibility of deception in things like framing and slow codes. Now, all these issues pose a dilemma for the clinician. Clinicians aren't philosophers. To be sure, there are exceptions. Lainey Ross and Peter Angelos are both trained philosophers as well as clinicians, but the vast majority of medical clinicians are not philosophically trained, and God knows the vast majority of trained philosophers have zero medical expertise. So what then should be done at the bedside? You might decide you should just eschew philosophical debate, default to whatever side of an issue currently has sway in clinical practice. Yeah, but that might keep us from asking questions that need to be asked. Alternatively, should clinicians in effect go to the mat philosophically, where this means that clinicians might end up differing in their practice because some subscribe to philosophical view alpha while others subscribe to beta? Although these clinicians are unlikely to have been trained to think through any of the arguments, or at least most of the arguments pro and con alpha and beta. So what I'm going to be saying is, as always, somewhere in the middle. On some philosophical issues, profoundly important though they are, they should be avoided at the bedside. They should not be grappled with, but others should be. I'm going to go through some examples and then make some remarks about the challenge that taking on a philosophical issue poses for clinicians. Okay, first to a topic that I want to avoid at the bedside, the question of personal identity. This is on the philosophical question of what makes Dan the same person now as he was 20 years ago. You know, I'm different in so many ways. And if we go back more than 20 years, boy, am I different. And this issue might seem fundamental to a famous case in the bioethics literature, that of Margot, an elderly woman with a do not treat advance directive who becomes ill and could easily be saved. She has total memory loss. By hypothesis, her advance directive covers the current medical issue. It was signed when she had decisional capacity, and it unequivocally says not to treat. Current Margot does not have capacity and so can't revoke the document. Indeed, current Margot remembers nothing of what happened yesterday, let alone signing a document several years before. But she seems content and by hypothesis is easily curable. Maybe she has pneumonia, could easily cure it. In arguing that Margot ought to be treated, at least one bioethicist has invoked the thesis that bodily continuity is not sufficient for continuity of personal identity. She argues that the correct theory of personal identity is the opposing view, the theory of psychological continuity. On that theory, the Margot who signed the advance directive is not the Margot currently in need of treatment. There's not sufficient psychological continuity between the two. And this is a move that the clinicians often want to make because they have a patient in front of them whom they could easily cure, who seems contented. But there's this advance directive that says, do not cure. And their temptation is to say, well, it's not the same person, so the advance directive doesn't apply. So you're handling the bedside question by invoking a complex philosophical thesis about the nature of personal identity. I could go into all the odd philosophical implications of making this move, but I just want to note a couple of bizarre practical implications. If we accept that the way to deal with the question of Margot is to say she's not the same person as the one who signed the advance directive, then we get some odd conflicts with moral and legal practices. For instance, as a legal matter, shouldn't the law now declare the earlier Margot to be dead and allow her assets to be distributed according to her will? And as a moral matter, shouldn't it be okay for the earlier Margot's children to think of their mother as dead and to sort of stop visiting, and by the way, to stop paying the nursing home? So this sounds like a mess. So I think it would currently be a mistake, let me be clear, merely a pragmatic, not a conceptual mistake, to decide whether to save Margot's life on the basis of what one takes to be the most compelling philosophical theory of philosophical identity. Here, avoidance of philosophy strikes me as the way to go. Consider now a different case. The standard for decision-making capacity is in effect a way to determine whether the patient has a threshold level of what philosophers since Aristotle have called practical reason. In assessing capacity, clinicians, however, tend to exclude the patient's values from the assessment. But this exclusion makes sense only if you assume that a person's values are not relevant to whether she has a threshold level of practical rationality with regard to the decision at hand. And that claim assumes a very particular theory of practical reason. I should note that it's a theory that almost no one, in fact, I'm really not sure that anyone held prior to the middle of the 17th century. And even now in philosophy departments, is a highly disputed view. So depending upon which philosophical view of practical rationality you're going to hold, you might count a patient as having or not having decisional capacity. For instance, Jessica, who refuses the food she needs to survive because she believes that being thin is more valuable than extended life. Some views of practical reason would find this value hierarchy irrelevant to whether Jessica has capacity. Other views would say that this value hierarchy is evidence that she is below threshold rationality. And I should note that in some of the literature about anorexia nervosa, it's fascinating to see clinicians subscribe to the view that values are not relevant to capacity determination, and then inadvertently and without realizing it, invoke the bizarreness of Jessica's values as a reason to deny her capacity. They want it both ways. So should the determination of whether a patient like this has decisional capacity rest on the attending physician's view about the nature of practical reason? That seems to open a door that maybe we want to keep closed. It seems to license a physician to deny that a patient has decisional capacity because the physician finds the patient's value sufficiently non-standard. My guess is that, as with the problem of personal identity, here too, purely pragmatic considerations counsel against making a bedside judgment on the basis of the clinician's position on a fundamental and long-standing philosophical dispute. So areas where maybe you shouldn't become a philosopher, you clinicians. But now here's an area where maybe the clinician shouldn't avoid philosophy. Take the concept of coercion. It's used promiscuously at the bedside to cover phenomena that frankly have little or nothing to do with the exercise of physical force or a threat to violate a person's rights. For example, there are times when it might be proper to talk with a patient alone, that is, without her family, and the frequently stated worry is that the patient is not asserting her authentic treatment preference because of family coercion. God knows I know that family relationships can be difficult, but at the bedside, families rarely engage with what any philosopher would consider to be coercion. And when you take a heavy artillery concept like coercion and you invoke it, it tends to demonize the family and to obscure what's going on with the patient. It may distract the team from determining precisely how to help the patient. Here, I think getting the philosophy right is important. And in fact, I think here there's considerable philosophical agreement about the concept of coercion, at least in its relevance to clinical medicine. So maybe here clinicians should actually get help from philosophers. But now I want to come to the two issues, and as I say, there are going to be others, where there is considerable philosophical disagreement, but where the philosophical nettle ought nevertheless to be grasped. So these are the issues, and in case conference would come up with these are omnipresent. Slow codes and the physician's framing of the choice that the patient must make. They're related issues because each involves some deception of a person or persons for their own good, either the patient's family or the patient herself. Let's start with framing. It's the form that the concept from public health world of nudge takes at the bedside. To frame the patient's choice is to set up a particular content for what is called a person's choice architecture. Nudgers defend setting up a certain choice architecture on the grounds, first, that it nudges the person in the direction that is right for them, given their likely desires, and second, that it's easy for the person to opt out of the nudge, to opt for the unnudged alternative. Like nudging, framing intends to have an impact on the patient's decision that is not based on giving the patient reasons to make a certain choice. Framing manifests distrust for the patient's intelligence or the patient's will, or both. In effect, distrust for the patient's agency. A physician who frames must decide how far it's permissible to try to affect the patient's decision by non-rational means, that is, to manipulate the patient. As for a slow code, it involves giving the family the impression that the physician will do something that she will probably not do. As you all know, there are more and there are less deceitful ways to talk to the family about what the physician will do if their loved one arrests, but the goal is inevitably to get the family to believe that the physician will do more in the way of intervention than she intends to do. I'm sorry Laney's not here because pure Kantians would oppose both framing and slow codes. Each involves regarding someone's rational agency as a mere tool to be used to benefit that person. By contrast, utilitarians might approve both framing and slow codes, and Aristotelian's virtue theorists will work case by case. I want to make the issue, however, a live one, even for any of you seemingly pure Kantians out there. Kant himself argues that you're forbidden to lie to, Kant was the purest of Kantians. He argues that you are forbidden to lie to a murderer who asks for the whereabouts of his victim. He even wrote an essay late in life making this claim. Now, most people who think of themselves as Kantians, and I hope all of you, think that he's wrong about this. But that means that current Kantians do permit lying in some circumstances. Some of the few great Kant scholars, Honora O'Neill, Chris Korsgaard, have offered thoughts about when lying is permitted. It's not clear to me that their arguments are adequate, but they are important. And of course, utilitarians and virtue theorists owe us concrete guidance about how far it's permissible to frame and what is involved in a permissible slow code. More to the point, if these three major traditions turn out to differ with regard to particular cases, that it seems that a clinical decision will be driven by what the clinician takes to be the most powerful philosophical view. And such disagreement does not, to me, seem like something to be avoided. It seems to go to the absolute heart of the clinical decisions that need to be made and to the clinical relationship. Here, and as I say elsewhere, I think philosophy needs to be done. So slow codes and framing are hidden forms of paternalism. Each compromises someone's agency. To assess either practice, the clinician must have at least an inchoate theory of what agency is, as well as at least an inchoate theory of agency's value, so as to have a defensible belief about when it is and isn't permissible to compromise agency in order to attain something of ostensibly greater value, be it a medical benefit to a patient or an emotional benefit for a family. So this poses a serious practical issue for the busy clinician. Ethics is a matter of providing reason after reason to determine what's the right thing to do. Wittgenstein famously remarked that explanations come to an end somewhere. And that's also true of reason giving. It doesn't go on forever. Still, reasons usually don't come to an end quickly. Anyway, philosophical reasons don't come to an end quickly. That's why I still have a job. Where they come to an end is often the crucial question. So academic philosophers write articles about things like deception, but they're not at the bedside. Clinicians have views about such issues and they make decisions at the bedside, but by and large, they don't go to the philosophical mat about these issues. I am urging that at least to some extent, clinicians do need to be moral philosophers. And the MacLean Fellowship Program might be seen as intended, at least in a small way, to train fellows that way. Now, of course, such training isn't the equivalent of a doctoral degree. But just to keep this in mind, Socrates never got a doctoral degree. He just conversed. Conversations about philosophical issues at the bedside, that is, conversations among practitioners and with others, maybe that's not fully adequate, but they'd at least be on the road to adequacy. My claim is there ought to be many more such conversations. It's worth remembering that the change from the paternalism to the autonomy model was a change in moral beliefs rather than a change in beliefs about some aspect of medical science. In part, this change grew out of conversations at many levels. Future bedside changes could do so as well. So I want to bring this to an end simply by noting that practitioners, that is, people who actually determine the content of medical practice, I think they ought to be ready with reasons, and sometimes with reasons upon reasons, to explain and to defend their views of the morally right way to practice medicine. And that means maybe getting more exercise in the philosophical practice of giving reasons to one another. Another way to put this, and then I will bring it to an end, is that our current model of clinical care, the autonomy model, is a very young one. It's what Mark will know this better than I, 40 years old, maybe at most, maybe less. How do we know it's the right one? people get, we have our various principles and the various boxes and so forth. Maybe they're the right way to go. But every day, every time I come to case conference, we're using those to make ethical decisions. And in light of the fact that that these really are new and they're being refined, we need more conversations. I know that's hard on busy clinicians. It's not sort of your comfort zone, but I'm claiming that you need to do more of this. Thanks very much. I got 3 questions. Oh, 3 minutes. I've convinced everybody? Can't be. Daniel. Oh, no, we have another. Hey, person.
This was a really important conversation. I'm going to talk about white privilege and the unspoken curriculum, but we think of professionalism as a process of moral development. But besides ethics case conferences, we don't really deliberately engage the learner and the clinician in that moral dialogue around what are the ethical choices that are being made at this moment. We assume that somehow they've assimilated those values and that knowledge, and they're incorporating that into their clinical decision-making. But in fact, once we're in practice, that conversation like stops.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you think about this trajectory of moral development with philosophers at the top. Where do clinicians fall on that trajectory? Do they get stuck because we no longer ask them to engage in this really important deliberative conversation and thought process?
Well, thank you for that. I mean, my underlying thought is simply clinicians, because what you guys do is so important and so complicated that you're constantly making philosophical decisions without perhaps being aware of it. It doesn't mean that they're not justified. They may be thoroughly justified, but until there's a certain level of self-reflection, you're not sure. You can't be sure that they are.
I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative and read something from the chat from Jay Carlson, who said, it seems like thinking of first order philosophical issues is more apt at the level of ethics committees who are thinking about what kind of rules we use at the bedside, but still removed from the exigencies of the bedside.
So Jay, thank you for that. But I actually it's certainly the case that there should be philosophical reflection about the various kinds of protocols that constrain what clinicians should do. But clinicians often have to make very particular judgments. And those very particular judgments, as we all know, are often balancing judgments where various kinds of moral desiderata are in conflict with one another. And you really can't do the right job of balancing unless you've thought through what is involved in those different desiderata. So let's just take slow codes. What Bill Meadow always said was, don't make the family's day even worse than it's been. And what he meant by that was non-maleficence. That was that principle. And when someone else would say, but wait, now you're deceiving the family, they're also saying non-maleficence. You're doing another kind of harm, form of disrespect, dignitary harm. You can call it what you like. But if we're going to think about what's involved in balancing those two considerations, I don't think a protocol will really help, because I think it may vary from case to case. And that the clinician is going to have engaged in some thought about what those competing harms are.
Thank you, Dan. We'll have to stop there. And at the next break, I'm sure Dan will be available for more questions. We now have our next talk is going to be delivered virtually. It was pre-recorded by Dr. Laura Roberts. So I'll introduce her and then we will play her recording. So Dr. Laura Roberts serves as chair and professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at the Stanford University School of Medicine. She is a physician, scientist in academic medicine and an internationally recognized scholar in bioethics, psychiatry, medicine, and medical education. She is editor-in-chief of the journal Academic Medicine and has served as editor-in-chief of books for the American Psychiatric Association since 2016. Look forward to this talk.
Hi, my name is Laura Roberts. I'm professor and chairman of psychiatry and behavioral sciences at Stanford University. I'm delighted to be with you virtually, but I'm so sorry not to be with you there in person today. I consider the center to be my academic home, the University of Chicago to be my academic home and family. And I'm sorry to miss this wonderful family reunion of sorts. I'm joining you from my amazing Ashland, Oregon urban garden, and I'm really pleased to be with you to celebrate Mark Siegler, our wonderful, wonderful colleague. As you may know, I helped Mark launch the Center for Clinical Medical Ethics in 1984 when I was a mere youngster, medical student at the university, taking off a year between my second and third years of undergraduate medical education. And I helped Mark with a different kind of baby, the center, and it was really amazing. And who could have imagined that so much would come from this wonderful center, particularly with the support and vision of the MacLean family, who just brought wind behind the sails of Mark's wonderful work, making this journey so much more meaningful and impactful. For my talk today, I'll be sharing with you an excerpt from a chapter that I wrote in this book, this wonderful book I put together, Clinical Medical Ethics, Landmark Works of Mark Siegler, published by Springer. And I hope you'll take a copy of it. We'll make sure to have some arrangements to have some there for you. So this excerpt will just, it says a lot of what I want to say about Mark and about ethical leadership, which is what we're going to be discussing today. So here goes. In his three-piece wool suits, wire-rimmed glasses, and scuffed Oxfords, Mark Siegler is not anyone's image of an innovator. With his emphasis on the doctor-patient relationship and old-fashioned values in medicine, he may not sound like an innovator either, and yet our Mark is very much an innovator. He's a leader of ethics, and as the title of this talk suggests, a beautiful living example of an ethical leader. Mark Siegler has redefined how modern clinical medicine is practiced and studied by integrating rigorous decision-making into all aspects of patient care. The implications of his work are felt in every discipline of medicine, every health profession, and across society. His approach seamlessly integrates careful consideration of values, the duties of a healer, the nature of a profession, standards of care, and novel interdisciplinary scholarship and evidence into clinical care practices. In 1979, Mark wrote, "In a sense, the term clinical ethics is redundant because good clinical medicine is necessarily ethical medicine." Siegler has insisted that ethics is not an afterthought or a luxury or a secondary consideration in our care of patients. Ethics is essential and necessary to excellence in clinical medicine. And he's changed clinical medicine, in my view, through a number of highly creative, highly innovative approaches. With his colleagues and mentees, Siegler has essentially invented a new collaborative interdisciplinary field of clinical medical ethics. And as he noted, the practice of clinical medicine has always been a unique blend of technical proficiency and ethical sensitivity, which together constitute the physician's art. As a natural extension of this work, Siegler championed the practice of consultation in clinical medical ethics, aligning the field with other consultative areas of medicine and differentiating consultation from the work of ethics committees. Since 1985, Siegler and colleagues at University of Chicago have performed hundreds of clinical ethics consultations in diverse settings to assist physicians in their patient care decisions. In his own words, ethics case consultations, which focus on individual patient dilemmas, aim to help resolve dilemmas, decrease conflict, improve decision-making processes, and improve patient outcomes. Siegler's model of ethics consultation blended in with ordinary clinical care activities for doctors. Just as a primary care physician might seek counsel from a cardiologist, a psychiatrist, or an endocrinologist in the course of routine patient care, he or she might now ask for an ethics consultation to aid in clinical decision-making. At the time that Mark was advancing this idea, ethics committees faced a stormy introduction. After tragic cases such as the case of a newborn with Down syndrome, Baby Doe, who died after being denied a pretty routine and life-saving surgery because of her genetically based disability, ethics committees were perceived as serving to redirect physician behaviors and countermand their decisions. Having a clinical case go to the ethics committee was viewed as a vulnerability and as a critique. With the introduction of routine clinical ethics consultations, Siegler changed the paradigmatic view of ethics and ethicists as watchdogs, working against physicians, to a new view in which physician ethicists as colleagues could enhance and strengthen the natural work of being a doctor and serving one's patients well. In addition to clinical ethics consultation for complex patient care decisions, Siegler also advanced a novel model of research ethics consultation. This approach involved the collaboration of clinical investigators and clinical research scientists and ethicists with the goal of preemptively addressing any ethical considerations associated with the project's methods or approaches. After 1987, when Dr. Siegler and his team at the University of Chicago deemed research consultation to be a best practice in ethics, research ethics consultation services started to be implemented across the country, implemented by the National Institutes of Health and in multiple universities across the United States. Fighting the trend of medicine as technologically rich but interpersonally impoverished, Siegler has also elevated the therapeutic relationship. He is focused on the attunement to the experience and concerns of the patient, and the accommodation that occurs between a patient and physician is central to compassionate, competent clinical care. This model resolves the tension between two models, the paternalistic model or the consumer-oriented model. His model discards these more extreme adversarial views of physician-patient decisions and the relationship between patients and doctors. Instead, he recommends this model of physician-patient accommodation as a bilateral one, he says, in which the moral and technical arrangements of the medical encounter are determined mutually, voluntarily, and autonomously by both patient and physician. He affirms that the personality, character, attitudes, and values of the patient, as well as the physician, plus the physician's technical skills, the nature and gravity of the illness process, and the context of care will each influence this accommodation that occurs between patient and physician. Siegler characterizes the accommodation as realistic and dynamic, always changing, always in flux, and always requiring attention from the physician in order to fulfill its role in healing. In its ideal form, he suggests that this relationship will feature mature and enduring exchanges of trust, bringing forward the patient's desired goals, which is why I really think Mark would have been a great psychiatrist. But anyhow, his accommodation model was often cited in the 1982 President's Commission Report on Ethics in Medicine and Research, and endures as the basis for patient-centered care, the patient-centered care movement in our country. In his work, Siegler has taken on some of the most difficult and highly complex, compelling issues faced in modern medicine. Highly innovative questions that he's asked include, what is the definition of medical futility, and when should patients be allowed to die? What's the definition of death? Can physicians ethically engage in euthanasia and assisted death practices? What are the limits of patient autonomy? And what of physician autonomy? When can doctors choose not to care for certain patients? And how do physicians approach radical new interventions such as hand transplantations or liver transplantation with living donors? What's the ethical justification for high-risk innovation in different areas of surgery, oncology, pediatrics, internal medicine, genetics, and other fields? Through his work, Siegler has asked, how can we ensure the highest standards of care when performing human research? Can ethics be taught to young physicians? And while other ethicists might ponder or pontificate on the moral complexities associated with such hard questions, Siegler has sought answers, in my view. He acknowledges that these solutions are often imperfect and uncertain, and often lead to more and equally difficult ethical questions, but they also provide greater clarity and possess authentic value for physicians grappling with ethical challenges in their everyday professional lives. Siegler's work, performed in collaboration with colleagues across diverse fields of medicine, has offered practical guidance for doctors, the health profession, and society as the ethical challenges of medicine has evolved. This guidance has changed the practice of medicine and has done much to affirm the public's trust in the profession. Over more than 40 years, Siegler's innovations have evolved into a robust educational and scientific agenda. For decades, every single undergraduate medical student and every resident at the University of Chicago's Pritzker School of Medicine has benefited from Siegler's direct teaching in the context of clinical case conferences, case consultations, seminar series, and annual conferences. Every member of the faculty, and every learner, including students in the college, graduate programs, professional schools on campus, have had the opportunity to participate in the exceptionally well-designed and rich curricular activities of the MacLean Center for Clinical Medical Ethics, and more recently, the Bucksbaum Institute for Clinical Excellence. And literally hundreds of clinician ethicists have trained with Mark Siegler, and his students have gone on to establish ethics programs, centers, and institutes on 7 continents. An outstanding educator and leader of education programs, Mark Siegler is an extraordinary and beloved mentor who's worked intensively, collaboratively, inclusively, and many would add relentlessly to enable the achievement and positive impact of his mentees. It is not an exaggeration to say that Dr. Siegler's education reach is felt worldwide. And while his scholarship has really been celebrated, I think his scientific agenda may have been underappreciated. Siegler's insistence that ethics questions are amenable to empirical study and often may be resolved through scientific inquiry is, in my view, his greatest and most enduring contribution. Siegler recognized early on that hypothesis-driven empirical research was a key method for illuminating and resolving ethical issues of genuine importance to society, including ethical issues that arise in the ecology of clinical practice, for sure, but also clinical trials, technological innovation, bench-to-bedside translational research, community-based participatory, and population projects. And while opinions, even very well-informed and well-reasoned positions, are common on many ethical issues, they often come into conflict, and they don't necessarily produce actionable conclusions. Empirical study, on the other hand, can actually answer certain kinds of highly salient ethical questions and offer practical guidance. It's Siegler's view and mine that evidence drives transformational change in medicine. Seeking and applying new knowledge are central to academic medicine. And certainly my own work on informed consent, biomedical innovation, health disparities, and special issues arising in clinical care and research involving vulnerable populations has been informed by this scientific stance. Siegler, with many colleagues around the world, has engaged in robust scientific collaborations of importance and impact across medicine. He's worked to bring evidence to bear on the challenges faced by doctors and patients, leaders in medicine and government, and scholars in diverse academic disciplines. Siegler's near Herculean efforts to advance an educational and scientific agenda at University of Chicago have ensured that not only current medical practice, but future health practices around the world are informed by the insights and methods of clinical medical ethics. In sum, Mark Siegler is the founder of an interdisciplinary field of clinical medical ethics. By insisting that ethical issues in medicine could be addressed through research, he really changed the field of bioethics, and he developed an area of study that directly addresses both the everyday realities of medicine, but some of the most challenging ethical questions of the past half-century and of the century to come. Throughout his scholarly career, Siegler has written hundreds of papers on topics ranging from teaching of medical ethics to end-of-life decision-making and ethics of advances in technology. His work has influenced care across every specialty of medicine and across the age spectrum. He's inspired the work of many other clinician ethicists, and his innovative approaches to the physician-patient relationship and ethics consultations are widely accepted today as the premier way to provide high-quality patient care. Students and graduates from his interdisciplinary fellowship training program in clinical medical ethics have expanded on Siegler's body of work and brought his theories and teachings to every corner of the globe. You know, I entitled this talk Notes on Ethical Leadership. Mark has been and continues to be a model of ethical leadership through and through. I know he was influenced by his parents, his mother, a kindergarten teacher, and his father, a ribbon salesman in New York, and his wife, Anna, who's just a remarkable and good person and a brilliant scholar in her own right. He's been inspired by the love of his children and the community of learners and scholars he's surrounded himself with. I'm lucky to be in this crowd, and I hope you will join me in thanking our dear Mark.
What a wonderful tribute. So in addition to thanking Laura for that great talk, let's give a round of applause to Mark for everything that she did. Didn't know that was coming, huh? Totally deserved, and I think felt by everyone in the room. So amazing. All right, our next speaker is Daniel Golden. Where's Daniel? Oh, there you are. Okay, good. Daniel Golden is Associate Professor of Radiation and Cellular Oncology at the University of Chicago. His primary academic focus is medical education, including education for medical students and residents, as well as patients with cancer. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Golden.
Thank you very much. That's a very hard act to follow. I will, I think, shift to something maybe a little bit more on the practical side with regard to ethics, talking about kind of my view of how we should be obtaining informed consent, giving some examples from my own practice and research and something we've developed to help improve the informed consent process. I do have a few disclosures, although I don't think any of them are too scandalous. Oh, I'm Daniel number 2 in this session. So let's see, I'll start just by saying that I think we often forget as physicians or in the healthcare system that, when we talk to patients, they aren't going around their daily lives thinking about, what's an appendectomy or what does it mean if I have oropharyngeal squamous cell carcinoma. These aren't words and concepts they think about until suddenly they have to come to the hospital for something. When we talk about informed consent, we can think about what does the word informed actually mean. The verb inform in past tense is to give someone facts or information or to tell them about something. And I think oftentimes in medicine, that's what informed consent is we say, well, we told them about the risks of the procedure or radiation or chemotherapy. As an oncologist, that's what I'm often thinking about. And so therefore they've been informed. I really believe that we need to think about it as informed consent in the sense of the adjective informed, having or showing knowledge of a particular subject or situation, or making a decision or judgment based on an understanding of the facts of the situation. As Dr. Brudney pointed out earlier, maybe autonomy is not the correct way, but it is what we have now. And I think to ensure that our patients have true autonomy, they need to be informed in this sense. So in my own clinical practice, I had noticed early on that the materials that we were giving to patients that were supposedly meant to help them become informed about their treatment process and about their cancer diagnosis often were probably not at the best reading level, or another term would be understandability for them. Readability is the quality of being legible or decipherable. And I think what is legible or decipherable to a health professional may not be and probably is not for the average patient. There's multiple readability indices that can be used to measure readability of text. Generally, they rely on syllables per word. So longer words with more syllables will increase the readability, or grade level is often a measure you'll see. And then longer sentences, so more words per sentence. So difficult and uncommon words will increase readability. And there's multiple readability indices. As you can see there, the most common one's the Flesch Kincaid, which actually you can turn on in Microsoft Word if you're curious. So here's how you calculate the Flesch Kincaid grade level. Again, total words divided by total sentences. So if you have longer sentences, it'll increase readability. And total syllables divided by total words. Again, longer words will increase readability. So here's 2 examples. I took the first one from a pamphlet that was being distributed to patients being treated with radiation from a national society. And then the second one is from a discussion guide that I'll discuss in a few minutes that we developed for patients. So just read the first, I'll read them out loud. The tiredness patients experience is usually mild or moderate and is different for each patient. Or what I would say is lower readability grade level. If you have fatigue, be sure to tell your doctor or nurse. You can say it's mild, moderate, or severe. So the grade levels for these 2 would be an 11.5 grade level for the first one and a grade level of 3 for the second one. And they look fairly similar, but some simple things to note would be that the second one has shorter words, fewer syllables. It's split up into multiple sentences. And for our patients that may, or caregivers that may have lower educational levels, that makes it easier to read. There are national recommendations on readability levels. The American Medical Association recommends that text being distributed to patients or families should be at a 6th grade level. The NIH and NCI recommend a 7th to 8th grade level. You can also think about this in terms of kind of common periodicals. I believe USA Today is around an 8th grade level. Wall Street Journal is around a 9th or 10th grade level. The New Yorker is around an 11th grade level. Also important to note that the average Medicaid enrollee reads at a 5th grade level. All right, so just think about that for a second. So I had the pleasure of working with some medical students about 5 or 6 years ago, and we did a couple projects looking at readability for patient education materials in radiation oncology. And in the first project, or the first study in, I want to say about 2014, John Byun, who's on this paper, found that the readability level was far above around 11th, 12th grade for the materials that were being produced by our national societies and marketed to physicians and clinics to be distributed to patients to help educate them about radiation. We went back and looked a few years later after publishing that initial article to see had anything changed. And unfortunately it hadn't. So the American College of Radiology, the American Cancer Society, and the American Society of Radiation Oncology all kind of continue to have very high readability levels in their patient-facing materials. We also worked with some collaborators doing a study looking at informed consent forms. What were the readability levels in informed consent forms? We collected about 80 informed consent form samples from academic institutions around the country and calculated readability. These are all the 7 different readability indices I mentioned earlier. And if you look, I don't know if there's a pointer. Essentially on the y-axis is the grade level. And so you can see the 6th and the 8th grade levels are marked with the red and the blue lines. I apologize if you're colorblind, but the dashed lines at the bottom, and you can see the grade level for the vast majority of these informed consent forms far exceeds the 6th or 8th grade recommended grade level. There are a few outliers in there, which is interesting to note. This is another way of displaying the data. This is called a Raygor plot. It shows the average number of words on the x-axis and then the average length of sentences on the y-axis. And so medicine, I think we're often challenged to come up with shorter words for something like appendectomy or stereotactic radiosurgery, but sentences are also longer and it's something that needs to be carefully thought about when developing these forms. Here's a word cloud of kind of the more common words that were in these. I'm actually not sure how some of these even really have to do with radiation, like angiography, but you can see terms in there: intervention, ulceration, electronically defibrillator that a patient may not understand. So how can we improve patient understanding to obtain informed consent in the adjective term, where the patient is informed and understands what's going on? Really, I believe the patient starts to learn before they even come into clinic. In the radiation example, before they come in for radiotherapy, they're learning from their primary care provider, referring providers, friends and family, often the internet. And then at the consultation, there's a whole interprofessional team that's going to help the patient become well-informed: physician, nurse, medical assistant, social worker, et cetera. And then lastly, the informed consent process doesn't end when they sign the form. We can continue to ensure that they are adequately informed about what they're going to go through. I think about medical education. I kind of had a aha moment, I would say maybe 5 or 6 years ago, that when we develop a curriculum for trainees, it's very similar to developing an educational intervention for patients. We have a needs assessment where we've determined what a patient needs to know. We have goals and objectives that we want them to, what do we want them to walk away with? We have an educational intervention, which is often maybe the consultation with a physician or a care provider. And then potentially an assessment to determine if they actually learned what we wanted them to learn. And there's different learning styles: visual, oral, reading and writing, and kinesthetic. If you're interested, you can take those tests to determine what learning style you have. I think this is pretty accurate. I find myself to be a very visual and kinesthetic learner. I'm not a huge fan of sitting in lectures. I can read, but I don't know. I'd rather learn by visual forms. I have to acknowledge Dr. Brian Callender, who is here in the audience, for kind of giving me this idea at a Bucksbaum Institute symposium about 7 years ago. He was talking about how he had been inspired to develop a graphic narrative discussion guide for patients admitted to the inpatient service. And he said he was sitting on an airplane and was flipping through the, safety pamphlet about what to do if the plane crashes. And he said, wait a minute, why don't we do this for patients? So this is an example of visual education. Another one would be Legos. I have 3 kids at home and they're often, building Lego sets, and we've all done this before. And then hopefully nobody here, hopefully this doesn't give you an adrenaline rush or anything, but some of us really enjoy building IKEA things. My wife teases me that, she knows when she buys something at IKEA, I'm going to sit down and build it right away. But I know there's also people that keep the IKEA builders on Craigslist in business. So we had the idea to develop a graphic narrative discussion guide, which was generously, the pilot project was funded by the Bucksbaum Institute that Dr. Roberts mentioned earlier, that Dr. Siegler also his brainchild. And in collaboration with the Illinois Institute of Technology, Institute of Design, we developed a graphic narrative discussion guide to explain the radiotherapy treatment process. So it walks patients through the treatment process, telling the story of this patient, Jane, as she goes through her consultation, has a planning scan that eventually gets treated. It's designed again as a discussion guide. So it's meant to be used proactively by the physician while they're talking to the patient, not a pamphlet to hand out. And I've been using this every day for 5 years now, and I'll show you where it's being used globally, but it's always fun to watch the patient visually learning while you're talking about what they're going to experience. And then there's a custom section where we can explain to the patient exactly what they'll need. There's anatomic diagrams. This has now been downloaded about 600 times around the world. It's hard to say exactly where it's being used. They may have downloaded it and said, it's too hard to implement. We're actually going to do a survey to try to determine where and how it's being used currently. It's since received additional funding. We're able to develop guides on gynecologic brachytherapy, which is a invasive procedure for women with gynecologic malignancies. We've also developed site-specific guides. There's actually 3 more that were funded by our national society. So this is the communicating the gynecologic brachytherapy experience. And then we also have translated these into Spanish called Cibri en Español. And that has been a whole separate project. It's been a lot of fun working with collaborators at UIC and Harvard that have expertise in culturally appropriate translation. So that's been downloaded. That was finished a year ago and already been downloaded. You can see primarily in Spanish-speaking locations, although apparently Japan and the Philippines also maybe have some Spanish speakers. So other types of education, oral, I think it's important to speak the patient's language. Doctor speak, I would say, is your thoracic CT is negative for metastatic disease. And they would give me a blank stare and say, is that bad or good? And what's my thorax? Patient speak would be your chest scan doesn't show any cancer. Reading and writing, so plain language, using plain language, plain writing. There's actually these certification courses and best practices that can be accessed if any of you are interested. There's some simple steps you can take if you have a form or something that you give out to patients. You can actually turn readability metrics on in Microsoft Word and get a Flesch Kincaid level. So you just turn it on, you run spelling and grammar, and at the end, when it tells you your word count, it also spit out the FK grade level. And then lastly, kind of one of my favorites is kinesthetic. So, some people learn best by touch and feel. And so this is called the little LINAC kit. The linear accelerator is what is kind of the workhorse of modern radiotherapy. And this is a little Lego set that can be built that shows, you can see a little Lego person laying on a linear accelerator. There's more kind of sleeker versions of this. I actually wanted to get this and I found out the company charged about $600. I said, I could stick with a Lego set or maybe a drawing. And then using anatomy models, things like that during a consultation to explain where a tumor might be or where a patient's experiencing a problem. So in conclusion, patients learn in different ways. I think physicians must cater to multiple learning styles to ensure the patient provides informed consent in the adjective term, that they are informed and understand what they're going to go through. There's visual, oral, reading, and then kinesthetic modes of education. And then lastly, informed consent really is a process that starts before the patient arrives and continues until they start or really have completed treatment. So I'll finish there. Just several acknowledgements at the University of Chicago, IIT, as well as funding from the Bucksbaum Institute and the Radiation Oncology Institute. And then my most important collaborators here who are somewhere in the neighborhood, probably causing mayhem. So thank you very much. Happy to take any questions.
I want to say this is really amazing. I had no
no trouble reading as a child, but raising a child with dyslexia, I have learned that almost 10% of human beings have dyslexia. And I had a real aha moment not so long ago in clinic where a patient was really bad while COVID said, "Doc, I can't spend any more time listening to you right now, but we have to talk about this again. And I can't read all this stuff you said to read. I'm tired." It became really clear to me that even really smart people need aids and help like this in order to help them get to where they need to be. This was the
Yeah, thank you.
question. So I find the word
Oh, here, there.
I paused as I looked at the word readability, because when I think of something that's has more readability, it's easier to read. So that's obviously just my problem. And you really are talking about readability as something that is scored, and the higher score is the more difficult.
Yeah, well, so that's one way of measuring it. They call it grade level, but
Right.
yeah, the
I followed that, but you know, my first-
readability would be the more readable it is, the easier it is.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what my.
So we actually, the medical students working with me published another paper looking at readability of patient education. Like JAMA has the patient page in the back. So they went and pulled a whole bunch of those from the last 20 years and ran readability indices on it. And no surprise, they were all way off the charts. We ended up managing to get it published, and that's probably one of my most cited papers in the last few years. People keep pulling it and I think using it as an example.
It's absolutely excellent presentation, and I think it's an important thing to be sensitive to, especially when you are working with grandchildren, as I am now, and understanding that at different levels, their reading is quite different. Thinking about what is accessible at one time in life is not is important, but what they're reading.
Yeah, thank you.
There's a comment in the chat from David Chulian. Thank you for including the reference to clarifying one's own preferred learning style. Any thoughts on how to best elicit from the patient family their preferred learning style, which seems to be an essential step?
That's a great question. I haven't necessarily thought about that. I think that could be difficult with time constraints in clinic. We had a 3 talks ago about, kind of the pressures coming on physicians to see patients. I guess in my thought, it's making sure that all 4 of those are used. So you're giving out reading materials at appropriate levels. You're talking to them at an appropriate level. You're using images or visual references, and then potentially a kinesthetic model. I think it would be my initial thought is it'd be hard to elicit that accurately from a patient. But oftentimes, it's just oral, just talking to a patient. And so like Dr. Landon said, there's many patients that may not even, they may be smart, they're just tired. They've had a long day. You're the 4th doctor they're seeing, and they had 2 scans that morning. And but yeah, that's an interesting thought. It'd be interesting maybe to give that out to patients in a clinic and just see what comes back. What % of patients say they're readers versus visual versus others. So.
A quick comment from a nurse. It's part of our education assessment of of patients in the inpatient setting. We actually ask for learning style and give specific examples about, do you like hands-on? Do you like visual? Do you like reading? Do you like videos? So there is something built into Epic for that purpose.
Yeah, preferred learning style. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you very much.
Do you have time for one more?
Yeah. Well, I don't know. Do I have time for one more? Okay. Yeah, we're all.
There's learning style. There's sort of reading capacity, but I wonder also people's capacity, sort of the salience of different things, and the way that we often present information to people that is so scary that it often directs their attention in a way that is not helpful. Like, say I'm having an eye operation, and there's a 95% chance that it'll improve my vision, and a 4.98% probability that my vision will deteriorate, and a 0.02% probability that my eyeball actually falls out during the surgery, and it kind of dangles, and there's this brown fluid that goes down my cheek. And here's the consent form, please sign it. And from a risk management perspective, you have to include the weird eyeball thing, but of course that should not be what the patient is focused on. And how do we present information to people that that just takes into account things like the availability heuristic and things like that, that are going to make it hard for people to make the kind of decisions that they would be able to make in a more reflective way.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of studies showing that humans have a hard time distinguishing between small percentage differences. You know, what's a 1% versus a 0.1% risk, and should I take that risk to achieve some benefit? You know, I tell people about risks when I treat them with radiation, and usually it's not that their eyeball is going to be dangling out, but maybe that there's a very small chance that they could become paralyzed or get a second cancer from radiation. And the way I close that out is I use an analogy that it's kind of like going to buy a car. You know, the things like redness of their skin or sore throat or fatigue is the fender bender. It's probably going to happen, but we'll deal with it. Things like paralysis or second cancer from radiation is like the 100-car pileup on the interstate. You know, it virtually never happens, but there's a very small chance. And so we need to talk to you about it. And I think maybe that helps frame it for them in a way that they can understand. We're telling you about these risks, but there's a different, you know, level of risk to these different outcomes. So anyway, again, thank you very much.
All right, our next speaker on the Daniel panel is Daniel Kim. Dr. Kim is an assistant professor and clinical ethics consultant at the Alden March Bioethics Institute at Albany Medical College. His research examines ethical questions that arise in the interrelations of self, community, and culture, especially as they relate to clinician moral distress, medical ethics education, and the nature of medical morality. Welcome, Dr. Kim.
All right, thank you everyone for being here. Yeah, I'm pleased to say I'm number 3. I think I find 3 to be a pretty golden number in many ways. So pleased to be taking that slot. So I just also want to thank Dr. Siegler and Dr. Angelos for the invitation to present. I think it's fair to say that in terms of my identity as a bioethicist, I grew up at the MacLean Center. I started as a member of the staff here, which furthered my interest in the field. And then I continued working at the center while I was a grad student at the Divinity School across the street, before finally becoming a fellow of the center last year. So I feel particularly gratified for the opportunity to talk today. So I'll be talking about clinician moral distress, and the goal will be to clarify the concepts, specifically by conceiving it in terms of the emotion moral agent regret. So in this quest, I'm joined by Wayne Shelton and Megan Applewhite, and all 3 of us are faculty colleagues at the Alden March Bioethics Institute. And incidentally, all 3 of us are also former fellows of the MacLean Center. Moreover, none of us have any conflicts of interest to disclose with respect to this talk. So in terms of the outline, we'll first clarify the problem, namely what, if anything, is wrong with the moral distress construct. Second, we'll make our argument. We'll show that moral distress is more fittingly described as agent regret, as opposed to guilt or regret. Third, we'll consider the practical import of our argument. Specifically, we'll consider a virtue of moral grief as an important response to our conceptualization of moral distress as agent regret. So moral distress currently has wide appeal in the clinical setting. Clinicians invoke it all the time, and they seem to know roughly how or when to use it. But if pressed, its meaning can quickly get confusing. And in fact, the scholarly definitions are also quite ambiguous. So the classic definition of moral distress comes from Andrew Jameson, who coined the term in 1984. And according to him, moral distress names the anguish that clinicians feel when, quote, institutional constraints make it nearly impossible to pursue. Make it impossible to pursue what they judge to be right. Right, so moral distress here depends on 1, a sense of anguish, and 2, institutional barriers that constrain a person from doing the right thing. Now, compare Jameson's definition to a newer definition that was published in an AJOB article in 2016. I cite this because it's enjoying some traction, including with the National Academy of Medicine, which used it in its major report on clinician burnout in 2019. So on this definition, moral distress names, quote, one or more negative self-directed emotions or attitudes that arise in response to one's perceived involvement in a situation that one perceives to be morally undesirable. Now, the impetus of this behind this new definition is understandable. Jameton's original definition speaks of anguish, but there are many emotions that qualify as anguishing, right? There are also many types of constraints on our ethical actions, and it's unclear why the relevant constraint should be limited to institutional ones. But in our view, redefining moral distress as a vague set of, quote, negative self-directed emotions that arise in, quote, morally undesirable situations does little to better clarify the distinctiveness of moral distress as a concept. Now, the problem here is practical. The question is, how should we respond to moral distress, both as individuals experiencing it and as a medical community? If the experience of moral distress names is unclear, the appropriate response to that experience will also naturally be unclear. So for example, some people have focused on removing institutional barriers that constrain clinicians from doing the right thing. Or others have focused on creating spaces for clinicians to talk about their moral distress. But still others feel that both responses are insufficient by themselves, and we, the authors here, fall in this camp. As we'll argue, these solutions are undeniably important, but they also seem to miss a certain depth in the clinician's actual experience of moral distress. We believe a more adequate response has to start with more clarity about that experience. So before we get to our argument, let me briefly say two things about our approach. So one is that a clear understanding of moral distress needs to clarify the distressing emotion itself. Much of the literature has tended to focus on identifying and categorizing the constraints on a clinician's ability to do the right thing. Now, the distressing emotions arise in the context of those constraints, so the approach is understandable. But in our view, there are a lot of possible constraints, and they're relevant only to the extent that they give rise to the distressing emotion. So if we're unclear about that emotion, do we really know what the relevant constraints are or should be? Right. Second, we're committed to an inductive approach rather than a deductive approach. So we build on cases to help define the emotion rather than relying on some abstract theory of moral distress. Right. So the point is that we're dealing with a practical experience of clinicians, and we're doing so in order to arrive at practical solutions. So we can now make our argument, which again is that moral distress is fittingly described as agent regret as opposed to guilt or regret. So it's unfortunate that we have so little time because I would have loved to analyze several cases to really drive home our point. But we'll make do here by focusing on a classic case that Jameton used to coin the term in 1984. So Jameton was a professor of nursing ethics at the time, and he came up with the term moral distress to name what his nursing students were sharing with him. They were sharing stories not of ethical dilemmas, but of their anguish in providing what they perceived to be ethically troubling care. So a classic example that Jameton mentions is one of utility. Right, so moral distress names the anguish of a nurse who, because of institutional constraints, must administer a physician-ordered treatment to a dying patient that she judges to be inappropriate. Now, in this classic case, what's the distress that the nurse feels? Right, or perhaps a better question is, what does she fittingly feel? Now, for his part, Jameton described the anguish in terms of both guilt and regret. He used the term guilt when he first coined the term in 1984 and used the term regret in a 27 article recounting his earlier work. So we'll consider guilt first, since this may be the more common way in which clinicians describe their moral distress. So in our view, guilt is not generally a fitting emotion in this case. For one, guilt characteristically implies a fault for violating rule or failing in an obligation. But the nurse in this case is not violating any rules, right? In most cases like this, treatments that sustain life are potentially inappropriate rather than futile. Right? This is because the treatments can indeed accomplish the physiological goal that's being sought, which is to sustain life. The nurse may judge this goal to be inappropriate, given her other values, but the treatment is often ethically permitted because the goal's appropriateness is a value-based judgment, and we rightly weigh such judgments against the good of respecting patient autonomy, which includes allowing patients to make choices that a clinician might view as tragic or even wrong. Now, for another, guilt would presume that the nurse can act otherwise than how she did, that she has a choice, right? But this belies her sense of feeling professionally constrained. She, in fact, feels powerless to do otherwise than what she's obligated to do in the situation. So guilt doesn't seem fitting either. So guilt doesn't seem fitting, but what about regret? Right. So on the one hand, regret better accounts for the nurse's experience of feeling constrained or powerless. But on the other hand, regret doesn't quite capture the sense of participation that the nurse clearly feels in causing the patient to suffer. Right. Her distress is not rooted simply in her inability to do what she wants. It's also rooted in the fact that she's personally involved in causing harm or pain to her patient, and this just feels wrong to her. And in this sense, regret also doesn't seem to quite capture her experience. Now, this finally brings me to agent regret, and we can use it to further clarify the sense in which nurse isn't simply regretting what's happening, but agent regretting it. So agent regret was described by the philosopher Bernard Williams in a 1976 article called Moral Luck. So to illustrate the emotion, he uses an example of a lorry driver or truck driver for us Americans, who, quote, through no fault of his own, runs over a child. Now, Williams here wants to distinguish between the regret of a spectator who happens to witness the accident and the regret of a truck driver who runs over the child. Now, the spectator is horrified and regrets what she just witnessed. Right? But she doesn't feel any sense of responsibility for what happened. But we'd find it really odd if the truck driver were to feel the exact same way as a spectator, right? He was a participant driving the truck, and he ran over the child, right? He was very much part of the chain of events that led to the child's death. So even though he was not at fault, we'd expect him to be distraught. And if he wanted to express his deep sorrow to the family, we'd consider it very fitting. In fact, if he weren't distraught in this way, we'd be disturbed by his indifference or apathy. So our argument is that the nurse in Jameton's case is more like the truck driver than the spectator. Like the truck driver, the nurse is very much a participant in a tragic situation. And her inchoate sense of feeling complicit in a wrong makes sense. But it's also a situation in which her actions are constrained, right? Like the truck driver is a victim of bad luck, which is not of his own making. And the nurse is constrained by institutional rules or values that are likewise not of her own making, right? In both cases, their agency in a tragic circumstance is constrained by realities that are beyond their control. And finally, like the truck driver, the nurse's distress is fitting given the tragic nature of her circumstance. In response, her colleagues might want to console and assure her that she's doing the right thing, but they'd likely find it very odd if she weren't distressed, right? Because that might indicate a degree of apathy that we don't necessarily want to see in our nurses. Now, with our argument made, we can now consider its practical import, right? What difference does naming moral distress as agent regret make for our response to clinician moral distress? The first thing to say is that the institutional efforts to mitigate instances of moral distress remain vital, right? Empowering clinicians to speak up, for example, is critical to reforming constraints that may in fact be inappropriate. But as we see in the case of the nurse, not all constraints are simply bad. They're complicated because they may protect other important values. So not all morally distressing constraints can or should be eliminated. Right? In fact, the moral distress can be a fitting response to a tragic circumstance, of which there are many in healthcare. So in that sense, moral distress may indeed be a signal that something is wrong and needs reform, but it also may be an intrinsic, healthy part of a clinician's moral life. Describing moral distress as agent regret invites the additional question, how should clinicians live with their moral distress? Oops, sorry. So we'd propose that to the extent that they must, clinicians should live with moral distress self-reflectively, specifically in terms of what the religious ethicist Mark Wilson has called moral grief. Now, moral grief is a virtue of self-knowledge, and the idea is to be disposed to reflect well on the question, who am I who has participated in this tragic circumstance? Right? This involves reflecting with an additional virtue of humility. Clinicians should recognize the limits of their agency so as not to overstate their responsibility in the tragic circumstance. Moral distress also entails availability and fidelity to oneself. It requires being available and committed to integrating the distressing memories into one's self-identity as a good clinician, as opposed to denying or trying to dissociate from them. Now, this is a difficult ask, but nonetheless, we feel that a disposition of moral grief is critical for a clinician's ability to cope with the many moral distresses in healthcare. So again, and we'll conclude here, we're not denying the need for institutional reforms to mitigate inappropriate instances of moral distress. But in addition, our argument invites clinicians to actively recognize their agent regret. The idea would be to respond by striving to avoid, on one side, the unchecked self-loathing of guilt, and on the other side, the unthinking apathy of mere regret. In this way, the hope would be that our clinicians can make ethical sense of the proper role of the tragic and the human, right, in one's self-identity as a good clinician. Yes.
So thank you. I thought that was really beautiful and harkens back to Dan's arguments, Dan number one's argument for the use of philosophy at the bedside. So a comment about that. I mean, I think if I'm understanding part of the argument, we get something that allows the nurse in your example from philosophy in terms of framing her understanding of the complex feelings she's experiencing around the situation.
Right.
So I'm with you so far, and I like that. And again, I think it supports further Dan's argument that he laid out for us as well. The piece of what to do with that is interesting because you talked about kind of fidelity to self and the capacity to self-reflect, and you interestingly pointed to dissociation. And so I would just offer some of Marsha Linehan's work around dialectical behavioral therapy and the real translation of that work into looking at how people recognize the emotions that they have, name the emotions that they have, and tolerate the emotions they have. While her work was initially developed to look at treatment of people with borderline personality disorder, it's highly applicable to individuals kind of across the spectrum of functioning today. And I think very, very applicable to people who are experiencing a huge complexity of emotion within the constraints of the healthcare system that often frames things in very black and white and not a lot of gray.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'll have to look into that resource you mentioned. Yeah, and I think that sort of having a space, and this is a case where that kind of space that people often advocate for talking about these morally distressing situations in a community context, I think is really important. And I think the only thing we're adding to that picture perhaps is giving that sort of conversation a certain direction in terms of the concept of agent regret and whether that situation fits or doesn't. And yeah, I'm just thinking in terms of one's professional identity and the role that the just participation in tragic circumstances, just that's the human reality and what that means for, you know, how we picture the ideal sort of good doctor to be. What does, you know, not a sense of sort of perfection, but being a good doctor within non-ideal circumstances of the clinic. Sorry, yeah.
Thank you for the talk. It's certainly a subject that is on the mind of many of us at the bedside, and there's so much to say about it. I agree with Elizabeth. I was going to give a nod to Dan's talk as well in terms of kind of validating the importance of philosophy at the bedside, and also the kind of gift that the MacLean Center has provided in embedding ethicists at the bedside so that nurses and physicians are more prepared to deal with these normal feelings and to depathologize them.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the doctor-nurse relationship also comes into play here, so that it's not this force of the physician acting on the nurse who doesn't have any agency, but a relationship between these people who are taking care of a patient and respecting that patient's preferences. So I have high expectations of my own resilience at the bedside, and have maybe a different ability to contextualize some of the grief and difficulty as a result of my training at the MacLean Center, as a result of my, you know, own experiences. But thank you so much. And I think we need to keep talking about this.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Yeah, and I would just add that I think that interprofessional sort of component in these conversations is just really important. And actually at Albany Med, we, you know, I think about a year ago started the shorts rounds, and that's, I think, a model that I think can be highly valuable in that respect, because it's, you know, yeah, explicitly sort of interprofessional. Oh, okay. Thank you so much.
I feel like for each one of these talks, we could have had another half hour of conversation, but catch our speakers after the session. Our final speaker for this session is Dr. Lori Zoloth, a leader in the field of religious studies with particular scholarly interest in bioethics and Jewish studies. Her research explores religion and ethics, drawing from sources ranging from biblical and Talmudic texts to postmodern Jewish philosophy. She also researches the practices of interreligious dialogue, exploring how religion plays a role in public discussion and policy. Welcome, Dr. Zoloth.
Okay, I was married to a Dan. My late husband was a Dan, so I think that gives me some street cred. So, and my only conflict of interest is I want you all to buy my brand new book on clinical ethics. So, all right, which I'm going to read. Practice precedes theory. Respondent moral gesture precedes justification. In actual creaturely life, recognition and human reply precedes philosophical reflection. That thinking is initiated by action and that it needs a second interpretive look is the premise of this book. The gesture of medicine is surely shaped by this, and the practice of bioethics as a discipline as well. This can be troubling, for it means, of course, if we're entirely honest, that the deep empiricism of the field will allow for error. And the readers of this book will notice many of the cases I reflect upon are cases of near-miss mistakes, simple human frailty, or a lack of will in the face of terrible choices. Yet the near-miss is critical, for it's the contention of the clinical practice that was the venue for the resolution of bioethical dilemmas, that the committee that I refer to in this work creates a methodology. The method is at the heart of the pragmatism of bioethics. It was the premise of my work and my colleagues that this collaborative practice of discourse would allow for enough different arguments to compete so that we would not err. We would come to the truth. This idea would be tested many times in our clinical practice, and sometimes it would not be sufficient. And this chapter, what I'm going to read from, is both why we believed in the concept and about the times when it failed. Of course, the task of philosophy is to come after and sort through the remains, the traces of what had been a possible choice and then discarded. In the terms of the postmodern philosophy of Emmanuel Levinas, there's a distinction between the saying and the said. The analysis of the cases later means that we can seek patterns that allow us to thematize and theorize, which is the work of the said. But before we can, we face hundreds of moments in the clinical encounter when anyone who practices or who replies as a bioethicist is being asked difficult questions prior to having something as substantive of medicine, even that which we know to be based on a medical knowledge base. The event of the bioethics meeting is held as the saying. It is the accounting. So who are we then, the bioethicists? Do we presume overmuch as if we had standard answers for the familiar dilemmas? Books about bioethics can suggest this. One turns to the chapter on, say, physician-assisted suicide or withdrawal of feeding tubes for advice, and one can, as some have eagerly suggested, create a database of such answers. Or do we understand far too little, walking unarmed into the complex terrain of the clinical encounter? The case. It is in the pediatric intensive care unit in the public hospital in part of the city that's called the Flats. It's in the early morning and the first light of a California winter, struggling through a cloudy window. We're in the corner of a basement conference room, and the windows here show the cracked pavement, the browning grass, the wheels of a stroller moving on the sidewalk to the clinic. One of the oddities of this committee is its peripatetic existence. A few people arrive late every time, apologizing for getting the room wrong. And this is because we have no set place for ethics here. We're nearly at the end of a meeting that began before dawn. We're discussing the options for care for a 13-month-old baby girl, Bonnie, whose own father has beaten her nearly, but not quite, to death, and then left her alone in a pool of her own blood. We do not know how long she lay there, not breathing, before the paramedics were called by a neighbor who heard the screaming and then heard it stop. She is, we are told, at 3 weeks after that terrible night, entering a persistent vegetative state, a profound coma from which she will never recover. Unstably weaned from her ventilator, she breathes unevenly, still fighting a case of pneumonia. Worse yet, an MRI shows the clear shadows and patterns of doom. And when I visited her in the ICU, she was flaccid, her eyes drifting, open, lost. We're told the teenage mother cannot imagine spending her life taking care of her as if she were nothing more than this soft, limp rag doll. In fact, her mother was not there the night she was beaten, barely comes to visit, and is not there for the meeting. The entire first hour of the meeting is spent with one after another specialist, describing the utter hopelessness of her condition. One of the many pediatric specialists, the trauma surgeon who saw her the night of her beating, urges that we withdraw all our treatment and allow her to die. And he makes the case with the text of his own life. I do not think it is moral. I cannot imagine my own child to live like this, he tells us. And when he speaks, there's a moment just after, when everyone with children imagines their own child, and the room is full of our other children for just one moment, and it is completely still. Others interrupt again to speak. Some worry about the law. Several members worry about being involved in an act of agency that would send the father to the gas chamber, for when she died in this 3-strike state, it would mean his sentence would be changed from assault and battery to first-degree murder. Then the talk of money is raised. If we do anything less than full and complete rehabilitation therapy with this baby, then state Medi-Cal would not reimburse us, and this sort of thing goes on, meaning that the family would have to come up with the rest, even if she could be taken home. And if not, she'd lie for a long time here in this impoverished state hospital, costing $500,000 a year every year. The medical team is urging withdrawal of aggressive care and wants the ethics committee to tell them this is the right answer. But we are interrupted. I have been told the grandmother is deeply in denial, but now it is her turn to speak. She holds a picture of the baby, and she tells us she expects her just to wake up and get all better. This is seen as very difficult for all, a lot of trouble. And there's much talk of psychotherapy for the resisting grandmother. Perhaps we can get you some help. But the grandmother is here in the room for this is a core part of our method of ethics that we practice. The grandmother thinks this is ridiculous. She's worried we're somehow morally blind. She says carefully, as if to people who could not understand the simplest realities, I am ready to raise her. I've told the nurses, and I love her, whoever she'll be, whatever happens. Somehow it's just wrong to watch and let a child die. With the help of God, I will take her home again, even if she is not worth that much to you. This is, after all, the woman who called Child Protective Services 10 months ago to warn them about the volatile father, but whose perceptions were dismissed by that agency because we suspect they saw her, as we did then, as an unstable witness. The physical therapist has sat quietly, but now it's his turn. She's getting better every day, this kid, breathing on her own and a bit stronger. When I come to move her, I could swear. What if she survives and we've not been aggressive enough? Then if she lives anyway, wouldn't she be worse off? Why not act as if we could help her? What is the right act? How should we think about this case? And let me turn, because it's the Shabbos, to a very odd text for you. This is from the Babylonian Talmud, Berachot 54b. There are 4 classes of people who have to offer thanksgiving. And this is a case about the possibility of life after very terrible trouble. 4 classes of people who have to offer thanksgiving. One who has crossed the sea, those who have traversed the wilderness, one who has recovered from an illness, and a prisoner who's been set free. They let them give thanks unto the Lord for his mercy. But what blessing should he say? Rab Judah said, blessed is he who bestows loving kindness. Abaya says, and he must utter his thanksgiving in the presence of 10, as it is written, let them exalt him in the assembly of the people. Marzuta said, and 2 of them must be rabbis. And it says, and praise him in the seat of the elders. Rabbi Asha demurred to this. You might as well say that all of them should be rabbis. Is it as written in the assembly of elders? No, it is written in the assembly of the people. Let us say then, in the presence of 10 ordinary people and 2 rabbis in addition. What is happening in this debate? Consider the problem of the text. When one who has survived mortal danger, one blesses God. A special blessing is said, but it must be said aloud and in public. It's clear, but who is this blessing witnessed by? After all, an individual can and ought mutter blessings all the time in private as a Jew, when you see a rainbow or the sea or a blossoming tree. But this is a matter of far more import, of life and death. What is the community that will respond and reply, Amen, Amen, this is also true for me? Should the community of meaning, the people who were there when you emerged from the very worst catastrophe of your life and reclaim your life, be the political leaders, the rabbis, or the priests? And this text answers in the negative, no. The Talmud argues what is needed is the presence of 10 ordinary people. The rabbis can come, but the assembly of the people, the minyan, which constitutes the whole community, must be ordinary people. Experts may attend, but ordinary people are the witnesses to the possibility of salvation. Okay, so what do we make of this bioethicist? When we do the work of bioethics, meaning the talk that surrounds the reflection on the crossroads and the journey across that sea or that wilderness that each medical case represents, we can know the talk is useful on the purely subjective level. We subjectively experience ourselves as more complete in some way, and surely more challenged than we were when we entered the room of the case consult. We listen and we say we like the talk. It makes us better doctors or nurses. We claim this allows doctors and patients and staff and families to see the competing moral appeals more clearly and to discern and reason more thoughtfully. This, we say, allows for medicine to be more compassionate, more true. But we have not been as successful in thinking about why this is so, nor in developing a theory to justify the subjective experience. And because of this, we struggle as a discipline about the meaning and goals and nature of the work, about how it is we can teach what we do, how we can develop standards of bioethics, how to frame the work, and thus ourselves as well. We struggle with the kind of experts we should be, and we use metaphors. We are architects, we are navigators. The text that I just read you suggests something less grandiose. We are the ordinary people. The field of bioethics is by definition based on the presupposition that questioning, arguing, interruption, and response are the means by which we question the truth claims of medicine and healthcare policy. The field began with the premise that another voice, One of at least critique, if not dissension, was just what was needed in any arena in which the hegemonic expertise of medicine held sway. It began with the idea that ordinary people's voices are just what was needed when the expertise of medicine was not enough. And the case that the chapter was based on was written just as bioethics was discovering the tools of continental philosophy, and we explored these ideas along with the pragmatism of the clinic. We sought to retain both. But what then is the meaning and role for the committee of the 10 ordinary people coming to consensus in such a case? One of the most important roles, I think, is not only how to come to consensus, but how to listen to the ones who are opposed to consensus, to the interruption of the dissenting voice. In general, the argument against the search for consensus on clinical issues are powerful ones. Some raise the fear that minority perspectives would be driven out of the field if their perspective on deeply controversial matters is not represented. And others argue that practitioners in the field cannot truly agree on substantive matters unless the level of agreement is banal, a sort of apple pie and motherhood of bioethics, and that such a level of unity is meaningless. What if the ordinary people did not respond as the expert would? Grandma's not convinced. Once you've brought her here, you do need to listen to her. Isn't the subtext of the halakhic ruling precisely that? Even there, at the sharpest boundary between life and death, one does not stand in front of experts. Yet how can clinical medicine proceed if we just can't agree? In an important way, the problem of discourse in bioethics is also largely an ontological one. In other words, I've argued that a theory of communicative ethics, a philosophy that draws our attention to the anthropology of the self as uniquely equipped to talk with the other, is the starting point for our claim for a theory of bioethics. Since communicative ethics argue that the language of the discourse and the process that creates the language must be particular to location and to context and to the conversation, which is where it is located, it does focus largely on linguistic norms, but not entirely. The idea that consensus emerges only after serious engagement and the moral agency is never to be seen as singular is also important for our understanding of conflict and consensus in bioethics. And this model suggests that not only do people need arguments in the ontological sense, but that arguments need and are shaped by the particularity of the agents. Since language has to be understood and jointly held, it's kind of like trade exchanges, which must develop, if not a common currency, an equivalency understanding. What is this worth? What is this cost? What is this thing to you? And all ethics presupposes such an initiating agreement. In the place of some universal maxim that makes moral sense to an individual as a rule for all, as in Kant, the idea here is that one needs an argument to fully understand all parts of a different occluded issue. How to arrive at a true discernment of a case would require an ethics that captures the strongest aspects of the argument of each and the most truth about the moral world. This most truth about the moral world is captured when several perspectives are exchanged and interrupted in turn. Instead of asking what I, as a single rational moral agent, can intend or will to be in a universal maxim, without contradiction, the communicative ethicists ask, what principles of action can we all recognize or agree to as being valid if we engage in practical discourse or mutual search for justification? And with this reformation, universality is defined as an intersubjective procedure of argumentation geared to attain communicative agreement. And this reformulation brings several significant shifts. Instead of thinking of universability as a test of non-contradiction, we think of it as a test of communicative agreement. What is sought after is not a logical unity, but rather what rules for exchange are mutually acceptable to all agents in the discourse. And this model asserts the necessity for others in the room, since one cannot simply assume that the text of the narrative is mutually coherent. The first act of ethics is the conversational encounter in which the ordinary meaning and the sense in common is negotiated. The intention of ethics is not just to posit a single agent intuiting a specific outcome, but to direct an action of communication that is shared and mutual in a discursive community. Thinking about a case, if it is to be true thinking, is a fractured, challenged discussion, interrupted by history, culture, the presence of other people, and your own memories and hope. This argues, in fact, for the necessity of the stranger whose outsider and different, strange view of the case allows us to see her side of the story. Skip here. One sees the immediate parallels between the construction of our work in clinical ethics and the notion of this ideal speech situation. For in our practice of clinical ethics, much depended on ensuring such conversation. Focusing clearly on the conversation, insistence on the reciprocity of the exchanges and on the plain speech was critical, we argued, if we were to honor the conversation that we were creating at the heart of the medical encounter. Such a conversation in which bioethics becomes more than a theory or a sort of aside from the expert in philosophy to the expert in medicine is only possible if bioethics is taken into the public arena, a place where the patient, the family, the nurses, and the social world represented by community members that we insist on including in the constructed moral community are there. It's an act of will to imagine that the plain talk of the ordinary world about ordinary trouble is worthy of moral notice. It must be thought about carefully to understand that the proper way to hear a case about rescue is in the midst of ordinary people, just as the rabbis of the Talmud decide. It is an act of will to imagine the plain talk of the ordinary world about ordinary trouble is worthy of moral notice. It must be thought about carefully to understand the proper way to hear a case about rescue is in the midst of ordinary people, just as the rabbis of the Talmud told us. It is not a sanctified location. It is a place of ordinary moral debates, the sorts of which we're all familiar. How to raise children, how to be a friend, the sort of talk that is the Talmud. By suggesting that ordinary moral conversations and not public courts of appeal or councils of elders be the model of moral community, the daily expertise that is needed is the wisdom and faith of the actual world, as opposed to the privileged communication of remove, delete. Of course, as a Jewish ethicist, this is familiar terrain because rabbinic epistemology rests in part on the subversion of dominant narration, the insistence on the cases themselves, and the minority view. Let me return to this idea of interruption in the clinic. For ordinary talk is always interrupted conversation, in which the central narrative is not valorized, but is proven porous, interrupted by the calls of daily life, of persons, and obligation. And for this committee, there was another interruption, and it took the form of a remembered story. Many years previously, the same committee had confronted another stubborn grandmother. And here's a text of that case. The baby girl was diagnosed prenatally with an encephalocele at 19 weeks of gestation. Her mother, who was 14, was advised the prognosis in this case was expected to be grim, for the fetus's brain was nearly entirely outside her skull. An abortion was available, but it was refused. The mother decided to continue her pregnancy and deliver via elective C-section to maximize the infant's chances for an improved outcome. The baby girl was born with a ruptured encephalocele, and the mother was again offered the option to forego treatment. She refused, and the infant was immediately transferred to the emergency surgery to repair the lesion and to replace the contents of the tissue into the cranial cavity. 2.5 weeks later, a shunt was placed. Baby was ventilator dependent and unable to be successfully weaned. Over a 7-week course, the baby developed increasing respiratory difficulties. A tracheal web with polyps was diagnosed and surgery then done to remove this obstruction. The vent dependence continued. A further examination revealed vocal cords were paralyzed, secondary to primary brain lesions. An MRI revealed significant brain malformation, numerous structural abnormalities, and morbidly reduced brainstem. The baby gags frequently, needs frequent suctioning. She experienced marked deterioration on trials that suggest further abnormality of respiratory control. In the opinion of the neonatology medical staff and the consults of pulmonology and neurology, the baby is terminally affected. They see no hope for this child to recover. The uniform opinion of all the treating physicians and all the nursing staff is that no further medical options can be offered that would meet the family goal of maximizing comfort and allowing the baby to go home to die. It is the goal of the treatment team that the baby be supported to be discharged home with the least restrictive care plan possible. And the expectation is that she can be comfortably maintained at home until she dies through a fatal anomaly. The team anticipates such death will occur within days. Now, reading my cold clinical report and the unctuous little final sign-off is horrifying to me now, for I was so sure of myself. Running deer was dying, and we were certain of this. Candidly, the neurosurgeon told the committee, I just stuffed the brain tissue into her skull and closed the lesion. I have no idea why she's lived as long as she has. When I wrote that case narrative years earlier, I did not include this detail. The grandmother began to cry. Then she got angry and promised us she would call the papers. that she would pick at the hospital. She would put up a sign. They don't treat poor kids here. They let them die. We did not listen to this carefully. We told her all about the help we would give her to transfer the baby home, and we did, with the phone number of the hospice team and a tiny infant ventilator. And this is why we were so surprised when the intensive care nursery received the phone call 6 months later after she was sent home to die. It was a grandmother who needed some information about well baby care. She did not have a pediatrician, for we had lost track of her, and thinking the infant had died swiftly at home, no one from the committee actually followed up. I only have this number, her grandmother said, but I guess it's time to get running deer vaccinated, right? Where do I go for that? We invited her to come back to tell us about it. It turned out she had taken her up on us on the offer to go home, and with the indulgent and slightly bemused hospice nurse, she weaned running deer off the ventilator breath by breath until she was breathing on her own. And one day she had taken that fragile preemie off the reservation for a healing ceremony, which involved the entire extended family kissing her and passing her around. This after months in her isolette, her body only touched by gloved hands, the sterilized clothes and diapers, every cc of formula, every cc of urine carefully charted. I'm so glad for her, her grandmother tells the staff. I'm so proud of her. And now, 9 years later, when we were considering this new case, running deer lived at home, went to special ed classes with staff members and children, some of them. Listening now, the ethics committee hears more, remembers the case of running deer and the other grandmother who is so proud of her grandchild, and in doing more interrupts the usual talk with the ordinary worry, we have been so wrong before. It is the power of the conversation, unlike the narrative, that is this place intended. It turns out that we who do the action, so we said, after all, we gave the grandmother time, what we called time to adjust in the first case. After all, in the opinion of most of the staff, the baby will die in any case in the week. But it turned out once again, it was us that have to do the adjusting. Once again, a week later, I visited the ICU and find the baby's crib is turned up empty. But it's not what I expect. She's not dead. When I ask, I'm told she is found on the rehabilitation floor. When I go there, she's in the arms of the physical therapist. She is teaching her how to wave hello, which the baby does, and the startled ethicist waves back. Pretty remarkable, the therapist says, considering that the committee nearly took her off life support. I had gone to see the child with another member of our committee, a woman who is a citizen member with a badly disabled daughter of her own. That baby is far better than my girl, she tells me as we stand in the hall. Oh, well, we almost did, she says, tears on her cheeks as she says this to me. But at this point, I would argue that we did not do the obvious thing, which would have been to go without question along the course of action the staff was suggesting. Because the point of ordinary talk about terrible trouble is precisely that it allows for the entrance as a significant voice, the interruption of the grandmother, to give a temporal attention to the possible correctness of her perceptions. It's also important to remember what made the cases memorable was that they were rare. In the case of running deer, in the case of Bonnie, and the case of others in this book, there was one person who had stood alone against the doubters, but in the words of her grandmother, she was not alone, she was with her God. She who had raised a girl who was perfectly healthy, but was driven onto the streets by her addictions and beaten by a violent man, who then turned on this baby. She was content to raise a different sort of child because she knew that nothing is promised or certain. Now, this long passage of the Gemara, which I won't read to you now, refers us also to the story of Lot and Lot's wife. And once you think about Lot's wife, you have to think about her turning and the person who regretted. After all, we're told that Lot's wife has 2 married daughters. Perhaps she has grandchildren. She is perhaps as stubborn as the fierce grandmothers of our cases. She cannot turn away from the tragic and terrible trouble that has enveloped her family. She sees her daughters burn with the mocking men they have married, and she cries unrelentingly. Of course she does, for she must wait and wait and wait. Perhaps there's any survivors, but all she can see is death and her whole life up in flames, and she cannot leave. She weeps until she is all salt tears. Lot, of course, is long gone, off to sleep with his terrified, motherless, clueless daughters. And of course, for a Jewish scholar, a person turned backward recalls the Walter Benjamin story of the angel of history and his lament. We move on towards progress with our PICUs and our certainty, and the contingency and chaos of past events cannot be undone. The babies cannot be made whole. Walter Benjamin turns to modernity and tinted backward to see the tragic rubble of lost lives. It is the smoking ruins of the city he sees. And this should be the stance of the clinical ethicist, I argue. We see so many changed events, so much contingency and catastrophe, that it can seem like a terrible routine, making our pulling away a kind of pile up of wreckage, the cost of progress that has failed, and yet on we go. But turning to witness tragedy and understanding the depths of the losses we see is terrifying, but is perhaps the proper place of regard. I carried the stories of these cases and these families for close to 30 years, turning to remember both the ways we failed and the ways we perhaps helped, all the times we tried to be a faithful judge. We can forget in the rush of the clinical world that every case we encounter is that moment for our families, like Let's wife, when your whole life is up in flames. And we can forget that for some of our families, some of our grandmothers, waiting to see about survival of any sort is a cause for a blessing. Bonnie was broken by a spectacularly brutal and sinful man, the daughter who really did get sent out into the night. And it was she we were also ready to abandon had we not remembered the other grandmother watching, and this grandmother watching, and remembered that it was our duty to stand with her, to turn and to wait with her for the morning to come. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
I think we've gone over time and look forward to more conversation as we move into the next break. So I'm going to turn it back over to Peter.
Thank you very much. So we are going to reconvene at 3:25. So we'll take a 20-minute break at this point. Thank you.